This is a narrative of the pursuit of justice, the reclamation of lost resources, and the restoration of hope in the face of adversity. Despite the prevalence of betrayal, the potential for triumph over evil and the revitalization of spirit persists. However, it remains perplexing why some individuals exude such unwavering self-assurance. Such individuals believe they are capable of creating and achieving whatever they desire. A trusted friend posited that these individuals are, in fact, misguided and that they will eventually face consequences for their actions. I concurred with this assessment but proposed that the process of reckoning might be accelerated. Had I not forgotten my jacket at home, the outcome might have been different. In a wholly different scenario, my 18-wheeler was fully loaded and prepared to embark on its 600-meter delivery route. However, my jacket remained in my wardrobe at home. The supervisor was displeased but granted me a few additional minutes to retrieve it, muttering curses as the trailer wheels grazed the curb while navigating. As I approached the final turn into my narrow street, I observed that the brakes of the vehicle in front of me were hissing as it came to a halt in front of my house. I was struck by the peculiar coincidence that the vehicle resembled the one typically driven by my superior, with the engine running. I hastened through the front door and down the hallway to the bedroom I shared with my wife as I swung the door open. The room was illuminated, revealing my wife and the supervisor in a compromising position. My wife was on all fours, unaware of my presence, while the supervisor noticed me immediately. His expression briefly flickered with guilt before he resumed his actions with a grin and trembling hands. I retrieved my forgotten jacket from the wardrobe was filled with a sense of intense anger, and I verbally expressed my displeasure to them, stating that we would discuss the matter at a later time before abruptly exiting the room and slamming both the bedroom and front door. I proceeded to the cab of the Kenworth truck, traversing the suburban streets and subsequently joining the freeway. Despite the initial turmoil, I was able to maintain a sense of emotional control. However, doubts about returning home caused me to become lost in thought. The truck hit a bump, veering off the road towards a looming tree trunk. "This is the last thing I remember." A distant female voice remarked that he was regaining consciousness. I struggled fruitlessly to open my eyes, but my lens remained immobile. And sensation eluded my legs, which drew closer to me. Another voice, one that I immediately recognized as my wife Diane, murmured, "Thank heavens." Additional voices chimed in, and I sensed hands touching my face. "Good morning, Mr. Hammond. It's good to see you awake again. How are you feeling?" A commanding male voice resonated. I attempted to speak, but words failed to form after a tremendous effort. I managed to pry my eyes open, and the room was brightly illuminated. I discerned several figures moving about, though I could not distinguish them clearly. "Mr. Hammond," the male voice boomed once more. "Blink if you can hear me. You have been involved in a vehicular accident and are currently hospitalized. It is imperative that you refrain from attempting to move. You have sustained multiple fractures, and we have kept you in an induced coma for 14 days while we work to stabilize you. Do you understand?" "Yes, I understand." I blinked once more. The recuperation process will be gradual, but with the appropriate medical care, the patient will regain strength and mobility. Due to the overwhelming fatigue and drowsiness, the patient closed their eyes and slipped into a dreamlike state. When they reopened their eyes, the passage of time was unclear, but their vision had cleared. They surveyed their surroundings and noted various tubes connected to their body. Despite this, I was able to turn my head slightly and catch a glimpse of the person standing beside me. It was my wife, who was sitting in a chair in the corner engrossed in a book. Upon sensing my movement, she quickly abandoned her reading material and rushed to my bedside. She was visibly relieved, as evidenced by her tone of voice. "I'm relieved to see you awake," she said. "I was concerned that we might have lost you. How are you feeling?" I found the question somewhat futile after weeks in a coma. How could I possibly articulate my state before I could respond? However, I discovered that I still couldn't speak. She tenderly touched my forehead before returning to her seat. Her expression was a mix of emotions. I was unable to discern her emotions. Was it compassion, anger, sympathy, or guilt? I maintained eye contact until she averted her gaze, confirming my hypothesis that she was feeling guilty. I struggled to make sense of my thoughts and memories of the accident. Why had I left the house in such a hurry? The effort proved overwhelming, and I succumbed to unconsciousness. Once more, I was undoubtedly aided by the medication that dulled my senses. When I next awoke, the room was enveloped in darkness, and the chair had been replaced by a makeshift cot. Diane was asleep, covered by a thin hospital blanket. As my thoughts wandered, they gradually coalesced. Recollections flooded back as I picked up my truck. From the depot, I realized that my jacket was still at home. I burst into my bedroom to find my wife with my company boss, and everything began to make sense. I attempted to speak, but only a barely audible sound emerged. However, it was enough to rouse Diane, who hurried to my side from her cot. I recoiled as she reached for my face, attempting to turn away. I hope my eyes conveyed the rage I had been feeling for days. I remained heavily medicated to manage the pain, in addition to having sustained an unexamined back injury. My truck was totaled, but fortunately, a trailing car had promptly reported the accident. The accident and an ambulance arrived promptly. Medical personnel began to outline the extent of my injuries and the rehabilitation plan that would be put in place. Throughout this process, my wife, Diane, was present in my room. My ability to speak returned, yet I was unsure of how to proceed. I was uncertain of what I should say to my wife. A member of the nursing staff seized a rare moment to speak with me. When Diane excused herself to use the bathroom, she commented that she had never witnessed a more devoted wife. Diane had been by my side since shortly after my admission, steadfastly refusing to leave. I chose not to disillusion her once Diane returned and the nurse had departed. I resolved to seek some answers. How long had this been going on? Diane, she turned to me, taking a step back. They suspect you fell asleep at the wheel. She ventured cautiously. They anticipate your recovery will take several months. That is not what I am asking, and you are aware of it. I retorted, I certainly did not fall asleep at the wheel, but something caused my truck to swerve off the road. What about you and my boss? How long have you been engaged in an extramarital relationship behind my back? I am not currently inclined to discuss my relationship with him. I love you and only you, and I am fully dedicated to helping you recuperate from this terrible accident. You may consider me ungrateful for saying so, but the last time I saw the two of you exhibited no indications of romantic attachment. Upon reflection, it also occurred to me that this was not the first occasion on which you two were together. She did not respond, and her expression betrayed guilt as she cast her eyes downward and avoided my gaze. Diane, how long, Steve? I am reluctant to discuss this further. Do you wish to pursue a divorce? I am not inclined to do so. Steve, I want to reiterate that I love you and only you. I want to have your children and grow old with you. However, given the circumstances, I recognize that this may not be a realistic prospect. Diane, you have breached our wedding vows. You have betrayed our marriage. I am reminded of the promises we made to each other to be faithful until death do us part. I am sorry to disappoint you by surviving the crash, but it appears you could not wait for my demise anyway, so the prospect of us living together happily ever after seems rather slim. Would you agree? She recoiled from my harsh words and sank into her chair, crying softly, hands covering her face. I believe you should return to your residence, Diane. You may perceive me as ungrateful for not appreciating your loyalty, but whenever I see you, I am reminded of my superior violating you. She cried louder, seized her small overnight bag, and stumbled out of my room into the hospital corridor. I was left alone, feeling wretched, when a nurse she passed by and immediately commented on my wife's absence. I chose not to respond but instead requested that she notify my supervisor at work that I was able to receive visitors. Less than an hour later, he arrived. I observed the truck and commented, Steve, you are fortunate to have survived. I was incredulous that he had made it out of the situation alive. He replied, thank you. I am grateful to you, Phil, for coming. I have been reflecting on the incident for several days, although my recollection of it is somewhat hazy. It is evident that something malfunctioned in the truck. Phil was initially reluctant to believe this, but he ultimately consented to speak with the workshop specialist. We discussed a range of topics until he finally addressed that the primary concern was whether Diane might have been with Steve. He inquired cautiously, and Steve replied that she had simply departed. He then inquired as to why he was asking. Steve replied that there was no particular reason. He then shifted uneasily on his feet before excusing himself and leaving. This interaction led me to consider the possibility that Diane's affair with the boss might. It became evident that the affair between Diane and the boss was not as discreet as she had thought. The following day, I was visited by two colleagues, George Lambert, the workshop foreman, and Jack McGregor, a Sternscott representative. Neither of them seemed pleased. Mac took charge of the situation and informed me that we had encountered an issue. He explained that he had brought George along to explain the situation, but that the accident was inevitable. He informed me that he had already initiated the process to inspect and clear every tractor in the entire fleet before its next operation. Management was furious because numerous deliveries would be delayed, and some customers had already threatened to switch carriers if we failed them. I was asked to take a look at the workshop log for the damaged tractor. George handed over the workshop log for the tractor that had been damaged in the accident. The log was an oily, hardcover book filled out on the day of the accident. On the previous page, there was a note about a broken spring on the front axle. I turned back to the previous page and found an instruction to do so. I did so, and then continued the discussion. Regarding the uneven tire wear, I discovered an almost identical note about a broken spring. The previous page had the same remark, dating back 3 weeks. I was perplexed. Why hadn't the issue been addressed? I inquired with George, who informed me that management had prohibited him from holding up the truck. He had a replacement part in the workshop 2 weeks ago, but they had refused to allow him to remove the rig from the road. The reason provided was that it would be fixed at the next service. George elucidated the situation, yet no one thought to inform me about this. I inquired, "I'm sorry, Steve. The boss was convinced it was a minor issue, so it didn't occur to me until the accident. I'm truly sorry that you're injured. It's my fault." George apologized. Mac retorted, "They knew the risk and gambled with your life. I contacted our legal team today and they've assigned Tim Delaney to handle your case. He already has the law on your side. It is imperative that we obtain book entries and statements from other drivers. This individual is a formidable opponent, Steve. We must address this issue from 2 perspectives. First, to secure compensation for your medical expenses, rehabilitation, and lost wages, and second, to develop a plan for your long-term financial stability in the event that you are unable to resume your professional driving career due to your back injury." Max's direct words had a profound impact on me. I had not considered the possibility of not returning to work. I lay back in bed, closing my eyes. Do not concern yourself with these matters, Steve. Your priority should be on recuperation and future planning. We are here to support you, Mac. His reassurance was comforting, particularly as I observed them leave my hospital room. A tear rolled down my cheek. I realized that my initial feelings of despair were understandable, given the circumstances. In a span of just a few weeks, I had experienced a truck accident, a coma, and now, the prospect of losing not only my wife but also my livelihood. The next day, Tim Delaney entered my room with vigor. He was a formidable figure, likely in his. He was in his early 40s, standing well over 6 feet tall with a physique that suggested he could be a professional basketball player. We reviewed the crash workshop reports and discussed future options. He inquired about the rationale behind your decision to abandon a 2-year business degree program. In response, you explained that your father was a long-haul truck driver and often took you along during your school years, which influenced your decision to pursue truck driving as a career. The transition may appear radical, but there is another reason I met a remarkable woman and we were eager to wed. She was not pregnant, we were simply deeply in love and pursuing a career change that allowed us to be together. It is a poignant story, Steve, but I have heard whispers that your relationship may be facing challenges. Am I the last person in the state to learn that my wife was unfaithful with my superior? I have confirmed this with your boss. Tim expressed disbelief and a desire to take legal action against the individual in question. He stated that he no longer cared about the individual, but that he needed the employee to begin preparing divorce papers as soon as possible. He noted that the company does not typically handle divorces, but that he was willing to make an exception in this case. Tim was exceptional during the brief period of time that he worked with the employee. The employee grew to be trusted by the individual, who saw him as having compassion, energy, and a strong sense of integrity. This gave the individual hope. He provided me with a detailed account of his proposed course of action in my legal proceedings against my employers and offered me the assurance of expert counsel regarding my separation from Diane. For the first time since the accident, a glimmer of optimism emerged within me. I proceeded to engage in recovery therapy and underwent medical examinations, including CAT scans, in order to develop a treatment plan for my persistent back pain. During this period, I was visited by an unexpected individual. He requested confirmation of my identity and I immediately became vigilant. He handed me a small envelope and, seeing poise, requested a signature before noticing the array of tubes attached to me, prompting him to retreat quietly. "Good day, sir," he muttered as he exited the room, disappearing into anonymity. She informed me that I had been served with a termination notice by the company. I expressed my disbelief at the timing of this notice, given that I was still hospitalized. She then requested that she call Tim on my behalf and read him the letter. Tim arrived at my side within minutes, visibly enraged by the callousness of the letter. He vowed that this would have significant consequences for the individual responsible for issuing the letter. He further stated that it essentially obviates the need for us to engage in a legal dispute regarding my ability to continue my chosen career. He resolved the issue. His detached and indifferent treatment of an employee in the hospital, recuperating from a work-related injury, will not win him any favors. What began as a typical day on the road to recovery shifted from hopelessness to optimism. Tim had a knack for instilling positivity about the future in me. He added, as he was leaving, that your wife was served with divorce papers today. Diane hadn't visited since. She departed in a state of distress, but subsequently entered my room shortly after dinner. She was visibly enraged, and demanded, "How could you do this to me?" She then proceeded to accuse me of infidelity, stating, "I don't want a divorce." She continued, "Steve, I made a mistake. I love you, and I want us to work through this." I was better prepared for this confrontation than I had been previously. I informed Diane that her method of expressing love was unconventional. I also stated that witnessing the damage she had inflicted on our marriage was distressing. It would appear that I was the last to be aware of the true situation. It is now evident that each lengthy journey I undertook signaled the imminent resumption of my meetings with my superior. I had previously inquired about the extent of your extramarital relationship, but you evaded the question. However, Diane, your repeated disrespect towards me in our marriage vows renders this irrelevant. Have I ever denied you, Steve? Is this your defense? I asked, incredulously. Diane, I had expected. I inquired as to the frequency of their interactions since my accident. She averted her gaze and fell silent. I contemplated whether her silence indicated that they had not been together at all. Could there still be hope? Our marriage had been solid until now. I reminded her that we should not tarnish our positive memories with anger and deceit. We would have to discuss the division of assets eventually, but that was not the time. I instructed her to go home if he brought her. It is recommended that the subject maintain a record of positive experiences in order to facilitate a constructive outlook. However, it is also advised that the subject refrain from expecting a continued role as a life partner, given the circumstances. It is important to note that the subject may experience flashbacks when looking at the individual in question, which could be distressing. It is therefore recommended that the subject maintain a healthy distance. It is important to note that the subject may experience difficulties moving on from this incident. It is therefore recommended that the subject seek professional support to facilitate a positive outlook. Despite undergoing daily sessions of therapy, my back injury remained severe. It was necessary for me to undergo stabilization with metal plates to fuse several vertebrae. This involved a delicate surgical procedure that lasted several hours. The subsequent recovery period was marked by persistent pain and a challenging rehabilitation process. I was eventually discharged from the hospital, relying on a strict regimen of painkillers. Meanwhile, Tim Delaney pursued legal action against the transport company with great vigor. He explored every legal avenue, despite initial hopes for a pre-trial settlement. The trial settlement saw me present in court as Tim Delaney presented his case to a judge by the end of the day. The overwhelming majority of witness testimonies favored Tim, undermining the company's defense. By the second day, the company's solicitors sought to settle out of court. "I'm aiming for maximum impact," Tim Delaney exclaimed as we entered the negotiation room. "They've lost and they know it now. They're just trying to in order to limit the fallout." In accordance with his promise, Tim issued a challenge, insisting on a minimum of $10 million in damages and compensation. He also emphasized my ongoing medical expenses, enduring back pain, and the uncertainty of retraining for a new career. Interestingly, even I found myself sympathizing with my own plight. The negotiation had to be finalized before the court reconvened at 11 a.m. This proved advantageous when the defense offered $5 million. Tim outwardly expressed dismay, concealing a triumphant sentiment, while knowing that a settlement would likely be reached between the initial demand of $10 million and the offer. Ultimately, he prevailed, persistently pushing for a resolution until both parties agreed on $8 million. I was gratified to learn that the figure of $5 million had been proposed. This represented the first encounter with my superior since the accident. I observed with satisfaction his visible anger at being coerced into this situation, as well as his inability to meet my gaze. The legal matters had been resolved. I made one last trip to the depot to bid farewell to my colleagues. George, whose meticulous records had highlighted the company's negligence, and Jacques, who had advocated tirelessly for my fair treatment, it was time for me to regroup and plan for the future. I chose to relocate to my parents' hometown, where I previously studied, and resumed my education in hopes of securing an administrative position. I purchased a 2-bedroom apartment near the university and a small hatchback for transportation. Returning to academia was an intriguing experience. I found myself a decade older than most of my peers in the group but also significantly more motivated. Success became a genuine aspiration. My parents were thrilled with the new arrangement. I made it a point to visit them. I procured a bedroom apartment in the vicinity of the university and a compact hatchback for transportation. Returning to academia proved to be an intriguing experience. I found myself a decade older than the majority of my peers, yet I was also significantly more motivated. I developed a genuine aspiration for success. My parents were delighted with the new arrangement, and I made a point of visiting them. Every weekend, I accompanied my father to football games or fishing in the bay. We also regularly enjoyed meals together at restaurants. Despite the fact that Diane had not signed the divorce papers, she appeared to be handling the mortgage and utilities. Therefore, I decided not to pursue the matter further, preferring to avoid conflict in my life. I was guided in this decision by Tim Delaney's advice. I permitted him to engage the services of a security agency to install multiple security cameras in our residence until the dissolution of our marriage was finalized. He deemed it advisable to monitor the premises without the necessity of periodic physical inspection. A couple of years later, I graduated with honors. The pursuit of a stable, long-term position led me to an accounting firm in the city center specializing in the field of corporate bankruptcy management. Their approach was largely innovative. Instead of immediately resorting to bankruptcy, their primary goal was to assess operations and attempt to restore profitability, sometimes involving sacrifices from creditors. I found this work fulfilling as part of a small team of seasoned professionals. My responsibilities included conducting forensic examinations of various companies to identify shortcomings and collaborating with key personnel to devise turnaround strategies. It was not long before my ability to identify corporate weaknesses and devise effective solutions was acknowledged. Both the partners and my colleagues recognized my contributions, and I was entrusted with leading my own team, along with a significant salary increase. One morning, when a new task arrived at my desk, I was taken aback to find that the company in financial distress was none other than my former employer. I immediately sought the guidance of the senior partner, who advised me to excuse myself from the case, given the potential conflict of interest. I promptly contacted the senior partner to request that I be excused from the case. His response was direct: "Steve, we are aware of your previous affiliation with this company, which makes you an ideal candidate. You still have former colleagues who depend on this business for their livelihoods, which provides you with an additional incentive to assist them in this situation. Moreover, I have confidence in your professionalism." My first task was to inform my former boss that our firm. He proceeded to discuss the perceived injustice of the situation, claiming that there was no significant issue, only a minor cash flow hiccup that had already been resolved. He further asserted that our involvement would be a complete waste of time. I politely informed him that the intervention had been mandated by the courts and that our team had been tasked with conducting the investigation. I also informed him that we would be arriving with my team at 9. At 9 o'clock the following morning, I expressed gratitude in advance for his cooperation. I ended the call, and it became immediately apparent upon our arrival that the staff had been instructed to provide as little information as possible, as they consistently hindered our progress. This response from management was not unexpected. We represented their failure to effectively manage their own business during the morning. Briefly following a group discussion with my team at lunchtime, I engaged in a discussion with Jack and George over coffee. After considering the matter, I reached a decision. I then knocked on the boss's door, entered, and suggested that it might be less awkward if he vacated the premises, allowing my team to proceed with their work. Initially, he outright rejected the idea. However, upon realizing that I could request his removal by force, he reluctantly acquiesced and left. It required 2 days to identify the issue. A young member of the team, a petite blonde with pigtails who appeared no older than 16 and had recently graduated from a commercial school, approached me with a ledger from a creditor. This driver is employed by the company and receives regular payment for long-distance trips across the state. However, I have checked and cannot find the same truck listed on any of the freight. The manifest reveals that the vehicle in question is being used for a purpose other than that for which it was originally intended. It is unclear who is responsible for bearing the associated costs. The phenomenon of phantom operators is a well-documented tactic among transportation companies that utilized subcontracted vehicles. It is typically uncovered when a member of the accounting team neglects to take sufficient time off, allowing the practice to go undetected. Upon examination of the invoices, it became evident that each one had been approved by the same individual. I requested the presence of the administration manager, and inquired as to whether the company had provided the boss with a laptop. He replied with enthusiasm, stating that the boss had been provided with the highest-end model of the 4 Dell laptops purchased approximately a year ago. I requested the invoice, and he provided it. If you would like to see it internally, I smiled and made a mental note of the boss's computer's serial number. My next step was to contact the local sheriff for assistance. I needed to retrieve a company device from a manager's house, and I suspected he would not surrender it willingly. The laptop likely holds crucial information for our investigation into his company. I explained the situation to the sheriff, who, though not overly eager, agreed to pick me up from the depot office in 15 minutes. I was instructed to report to the depot office in 15 minutes. During the drive, I was questioned by the sheriff. He inquired as to whether I had previously been employed by the organization. I confirmed that I had, and he asked if I recalled the unfortunate accident. I replied in the affirmative and described the circumstances surrounding the recovery of the wreckage. He then asked if I felt fortunate to have survived. I replied that I did, but that things often work out in the end. He then asked if I had left my wife when I relocated. I confirmed that I had, and he followed up by asking if I still had feelings for her. He inquired if the man was still involved with her. I replied that I was unaware of the specifics. I had filed for divorce and the dissolution of the marriage was not yet finalized. However, I was not currently romantically attached to anyone and was not concerned about the man's relationship status. I explained that the man visited her during the day and that she spent her nights alone. The man was married with children and returned home every night. It was likely that his wife was unaware of the situation. The sheriff commented that this made two. I retorted bitterly, I was similarly unaware of the situation until I discovered them in the act on the day of the accident. We had agreed that the sheriff would allow me to request the laptop and intervene only if necessary. Initially, he attempted to pass off an older, different model laptop. However, upon realizing I had the make and serial number of the unit we were seeking and seeing the sheriff approach, I demanded the laptop. From the squad car, he reluctantly surrendered the laptop, assuring me it would be returned within 24 hours. Anticipating that this time frame might be accurate, I requested the sheriff to drop me back at the office, where I gathered my team. One member was tasked with immediately downloading the entire contents of the laptop onto our security server. This precaution would enable us to comply with any court order for its return while also maintaining a hidden autofoot function was employed to monitor subsequent activity in accordance with expectations. A young lawyer, likely new to the profession, arrived to demand the laptop's immediate return. Initially, it was argued that the laptop belonged to the company, not the lawyer's client. However, it was ultimately conceded that the lawyer had the authority to take possession. The laptop had been carefully returned to its case before the lawyer's arrival, giving the impression that it had not been accessed. The lawyer, who had been in possession of the laptop, was now in a position to examine its contents. He was eager to do so, having been convinced that he and his team had successfully identified any evidence of wrongdoing. Meanwhile, the IT team was examining the downloaded data. They were able to access all areas of the laptop with minimal effort, due to the lack of passwords. The team focused on the bank records and discovered a series of transactions that had been made over several years. These transactions had gradually increased in both the amount and frequency. It became evident that our target was diverting substantial sums of money through the use of fraudulent invoices, which were approved by him. Our subsequent objective was to trace the money trail, which initially led to a bank account under the guise of a phantom contractor, which was in fact controlled by the company's boss. The account maintained only a nominal balance, indicating the funds were being redirected to evade detection by deciphering the codes from the downloaded files. Some of the accounts where the money had been concealed were uncovered. These accounts were dispersed across various countries under different names. It was time to enlist the expertise of Tim Delaney, the lawyer who had successfully handled the compensation case. He was still with the same firm and had been promoted to partner. Since our last encounter, he appeared gratified to see me and was eagerly anticipating the opportunity to pursue legal action against my former boss. After days of intense meetings with regulatory authorities and law enforcement agencies, we concluded that it was necessary for the police to immediately press charges of embezzlement and to seek immediate incarceration without bail to prevent the defendant from fleeing the jurisdiction. On the day of James Seward's arrest, I received a visitor at the transportation company office. Steve informed me that a Mrs. Seward was waiting at the reception desk. The young receptionist instructed me to send her in, and I anticipated that this encounter would be intriguing. The woman who entered my temporary office, which was actually the boss's office in his absence, was stunning. She was blonde, she was well-built, impeccably dressed, and exuded elegance. Extending her hand for a handshake, she sat gracefully in a visitor's chair opposite my desk. After a surprisingly firm grip, Mr. Hammond introduced himself as James Seward, her spouse. I had gathered as much. "How may I assist you, Mrs. Seward?" I was aware that she played a role in my husband's imprisonment. "Such an assertion may be somewhat exaggerated, Mrs. Seward. Our evidence suggests that your husband engaged in the unlawful diversion of substantial funds from his own company, thereby jeopardizing its future due to the risk of flight. He has been detained pending trial, which effectively means that it is your husband's actions that have led to his imprisonment, not mine. What knowledge do you possess regarding the company's ownership structure, Mr. Hammond?" "The only information available in the corporate records is that 2 shares are held individually by you and your husband. However, you are already aware of this. Why do you inquire about this, Mr. Hammond?" "I believe that if I were to mention my maiden name, you would immediately recognize my family. We were among the earliest investors in this company and have provided the majority of its financing, primarily through loans secured by my family. As previously stated, there are 2 shares, but the entirety of the company's funding has been provided by my family. In the event of a company failure, my husband stands to lose 1 share that was initially given to him. He demonstrated competence in managing the company during its early stages, and I still have faith in his abilities. However, the situation was becoming increasingly complicated. Upon our initial examination of the company's structure, we noted a significant number of loans originating from a single investor. From a single investor, but we had not yet linked this to Seward's wife, Mrs. Seward. Without intent to cause any disrespect to your husband, our investigation suggests that he has not been entirely honest with you. This will be taken into account by the court in the upcoming weeks. We've already taken legal action to prevent him from accessing any part of the company's affairs. Additionally, we've reassured the staff that the organization is likely to trade its way out of its financial difficulties. Our findings indicate that it should be operating profitably, and its current precarious state. The result of illicit activities is a matter of public record, the details of which I am not at liberty to disclose. However, I can assure you that we will not leave until we are confident in securing the company's future or, if necessary, liquidating its assets. The refined lady, Rose, noted, thanked me, and gracefully exited the office, leaving a hint of by the time the court convened, we had amassed sufficient evidence to substantiate our claims. Our investigation not only revealed how Seward had moved funds through the use of a fictitious contractor but also identified the specific dates and locations of the transfers. However, the rationale behind his actions remained opaque, as none of the misappropriated funds were observed to have been expended within the courtroom. Our legal counsel, Tim Delaney, methodically dismantled Seward's defense. Initially, Seward attempted to evade direct inquiries, seemingly unaware of the extent of our accumulated information. What he was not cognizant of was that Tim Delaney had security cameras in place. In addition, he had not mentioned the security cameras that had been installed since his previous appearance in court. When Seward was brought back to the witness stand, he was unable to respond to a series of financial inquiries before Delaney abruptly changed the subject. "Mr. Seward," he began, "are you acquainted with a Mrs. Diane Hammond?" The witness replied, visibly pale, and requested elaboration on his relationship with Mrs. Hammond. He confirmed that she was the spouse of one of his former drivers and that they would occasionally meet at company gatherings. He then inquired whether there was anything else he wished to disclose about his association with Mrs. Hammond. Tim Delaney persisted in his probing, and the witness replied, "I have no personal relationship with Mrs. Hammond, as I mentioned. She is the wife of a former employee who is currently involved in investigating my company." Delaney then asked, "Have you ever engaged in sexual activity with Mrs. Hammond?" The witness was not released immediately, as the defense requested. Instead, the court permitted the witness to be recalled at a later point in the proceedings. The defense then called Mr. Brian Smith to the stand. Smith, a 40-year-old man of considerable stature, was sworn in. He informed the court that he worked as a security consultant for ABC Security. He was then asked to provide the court with the details of the task he had been assigned on April 19, 2 years prior. Smith explained that he had been tasked with installing 5 security cameras. In the residence owned by Mr. and Mrs. Steve Hammond, are these cameras still operational? Mr. Smith, affirmative. Their footage is automatically transferred to our servers every 24 hours. It seems plausible that this is the location where the photograph was taken. The man in the photograph is almost certainly James Seward, the defendant. I am not familiar with the woman in the photograph, but she is seated in the gallery that he pointed out. Could you describe to the court what the individuals in the photograph were doing at the time? They were engaged in sexual activity, specifically sexual intercourse. I have 4 additional photographs taken at separate times over recent weeks from the security cameras in the home, which I would like to submit to the court as evidence. I hereby submit an affidavit from Mr. Smith, which attests to the veracity of the photographs and the placement of the security cameras. I respectfully request that Mr. Seward be recalled to the stand. The witness had received a severe beating and, in response to further questioning, initially avoided eye contact with the court as he attempted to evade further inquiries. However, after the proceedings with Seward concluded, the court adjourned until the following day. Upon reconvening, the judge promptly addressed the matter, finding Seward guilty of embezzlement amounting to millions of dollars, as well as additionally, the judge made note of the potential charges related to Seward's inappropriate relationship with an employee. Sentencing was postponed for several weeks, and we were gratified by the outcome of our efforts to obtain information regarding overseas financial institutions and account details. The majority of the funds were recoverable. Meeting with Phil George, Jack, and others on staff at the transport terminal was a genuine pleasure, as we assured them that the missing funds had been located, outstanding debt settled, and the courts had granted permission for normal trading. The resumption of activities was imminent. Phil was poised to assume the CEO position, and with the support of his dedicated team, the company was expected to thrive once again. Ownership now rested firmly with Seward's wife, who had proven to be a steadfast supporter during their hardships. A few days later, during dinner, with Tim Delaney, Diane approached our table. Rose greeted her and extended an invitation to join us, as we had just placed our orders. I promptly signaled a waiter to take Diane's drink and meal preferences. She appeared visibly uncomfortable in our company, and Tim Delaney also did not seem pleased. She began by apologizing for the intrusion, stating that she had realized it was time for a conversation after discovering that dinner reservations had been made at the establishment. She then inquired about the nature of the matter on her mind, noting that James and she had previously made plans. She continued, stating that she had hoped to leave the country together and start a new life abroad. She said that James had been hinting that he would soon have the means to support their life together, but that he had never disclosed how. She was stunned when the company went bankrupt, as she had believed it was thriving. She was even more shocked in court too. I have recently become aware of the fact that my partner, Steve, who has been my partner for a number of years, was planning to fund our life together by embezzling funds from his own company. This is not an appropriate time or place for us to be discussing this matter. I began to indicate my discomfort. Perhaps we could discuss this at another time. There is no need for a conversation, Steve. I was foolish to discard your love so recklessly, and even more foolish to think our relationship was serious when I knew all along that James was still involved with his wife. I doubt I was ever more than a secret affair in his mind when I initially began seeing him while you were out of town, but I gradually allowed myself to believe that I was in love with him. Based on the amount of money that he was able to hide over the past few years, it is evident that he must have had feelings for me as well. However, that is not the reason why I am here, searching through her purse. I retrieved a crumpled piece of paper. It was a divorce petition that Steve had signed without any strings attached. As a result, I am now officially divorced. We will need to discuss the house, but I will not be making any further claims, given that I am the one who was responsible for the breakdown of our relationship. Thank you for the dinner. She then produced an invitation, but I suddenly lost my appetite. Good night, she said, rising hastily and attempting to conceal the tears that were welling up in her eyes. She then hurried away. I found this turn of events somewhat unexpected. I remarked to Tim Delaney, well, that was certainly an unanticipated turn of events. About a month later, the courtroom at the Rec convened for the sentencing hearing. Tim Delaney and I elected to attend, as did Diane, who was dressed in a business suit and appeared to be in good health. The sentencing was brief. The judge recited the charges and the guilty verdict, imposing extensive jail time for each offense, resulting in a total of over 20 years. The total sentence amounted to over 20 years, but with time already served, Seward would be eligible for parole in 9 years and 7 months. As he glanced up and caught my eye, observing the relief expression on my face, he mouthed something that might have been, "You," but I was content, or perhaps, "the conniving man who stole my wife." While I was engaged in the arduous task of driving trucks across the country, he was finally facing the consequences of his actions within a span of 3 months. He lost his hidden wealth, his wife, his business, and his mistress as he was escorted away to begin his sentence. I flashed him my most cheerful smile, only then noticing that he was soon to be my wife was present in the gallery. He smiled at me as we crossed paths near the exit. He inquired as to whether I would care to join him for lunch. He extended the invitation, offering to provide the details at a later time. I was positioned a couple of steps behind her, and I was able to hear every word. My wife, Diane, was situated in close proximity. I expressed my desire to do so with a smile. Diane appeared to be in a state of disbelief and swiftly averted her gaze. The woman took my arm as I offered it, and we proceeded at a leisurely pace to a tranquil restaurant situated in close proximity to the courthouse. After enduring years of anguish, embarrassment, and disappointment, I finally felt optimistic about what the future might bring. This narrative illustrates that even in the darkest moments of life, there is hope. It demonstrates how justice can overcome evil and how losses can lead to new beginnings and growth.